The Glass Cathedral. Dorian Ashvale had built his life the way other men build walls, fast, high, and with no door left open behind him. By 32, he was the kind of name that appeared in headlines before breakfast and in whispered boardroom conversations after dark. Ashvale Technologies had grown from a two-person startup operating out of a leaking apartment into one of the most cited infrastructure companies in the country. Journalists described him as visionary. Investors called him relentless. His staff, behind closed doors and over cold coffee, called him unreachable. What none of them knew, what Dorian himself rarely admitted in the low, unguarded hours before sleep, was that he had never felt like he belonged to any of it. He had grown up poor in a way that left a specific kind of scar. Not the loud, dramatic poverty of crisis, but the quiet, grinding kind. The sort that teaches you to eat less so your younger sister can eat more. The sort that makes you memorize the feeling of embarrassment so thoroughly that even after the money comes, you keep checking over your shoulder for it. The empire he'd built was, in many ways, a very expensive way of running from that boy. Sarah Calloway had not been part of his plan. He had met her at a literary charity event 3 years ago. One of those evenings he attended purely for optics, standing near a sculpture that cost more than his childhood home, nursing a drink he didn't want. She had been tucked into a corner with a glass of sparkling water and a small notebook, writing something in the margins of the event program. He'd asked what she was writing. She'd looked up with zero reverence, zero recognition, actually, and said, "A better version of the speech that man just gave." He had laughed for the first time in months. They were married 11 months later in a ceremony so quiet it made his publicist nervous. No celebrity guests. No press. Just a small stone chapel, 40 people who actually knew their names, and Sarah in a cream dress reading a poem she had written herself. Something about tide patterns and how some things return not because they are pulled back but because they never truly left. Dorian had memorized every word without trying. That was 3 years ago. Now he stood in the doorway of their home library at 9:15 on a Tuesday evening, still in his suit jacket, briefcase in hand, and watched his wife cry over something she was trying to hide. The room was warm and amberlit. Books lined every wall, Sarah's doing, her one unapologetic luxury. She was curled into the window seat with her knees drawn up, and she didn't hear him come in because the rain had started against the glass. In her hands was an old book, a worn collection of Neruda that Dorian recognized from her shelf. Tucked inside it, rather than a bookmark, was a folded letter. She had it pressed to her chest now, eyes closed, shoulders shaking in that contained way people cry when they have been practicing doing it alone for a long time. Dorian didn't move. Something in the stillness of the moment told him, with the calm, dreadful certainty of a man who had always trusted his instincts in rooms where deals were being made, that he was standing at the edge of something. That whatever he did next would matter in a way that couldn't be undone. He stepped forward. The floorboard announced him. Sarah's eyes opened. For one unguarded second before her expression reset, he saw something in her face he didn't have a word for. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something older and more complicated than guilt. It looked like grief mixed with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight they chose to carry, and chosen it because they loved something too much to put it down. "Dorian," she said softly, "you're home early." "The Milan meeting fell through," he said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. "Who wrote the letter, Sarah?" The rain pressed harder against the glass. She pulled the letter a little closer to her chest, not defensively, but the way you hold something fragile when the air in the room shifts. "It's not what you're thinking," she said. But the thing about a man who had built everything on reading rooms and reading people was that he had already seen the return address stamped on the envelope's corner before she'd moved her hand. Harwick Correctional Facility. Dorian set down his briefcase very carefully and sat in the chair across from her. "Then tell me what it is," he said. The name written in ink. He did not sleep that night. Not because there had been a dramatic confrontation. There hadn't been. Sarah had said only that the letter was personal, that she would explain when she was ready, that she needed one night. And Dorian, who prided himself on being decisive, who had never in his professional life given anyone a grace period without demanding collateral, had nodded. Had kissed her forehead. Had gone to bed beside her and listened to her breathing even out while his own stayed shallow and irregular until dawn. The name on the return address was Fen Calloway. He had his assistant run a search by 6 in the morning. What came back was not what he expected. Fen Callaway, 31. Convicted 4 years ago on charges of financial fraud and corporate espionage. Sentenced to 7 years at Harwick. The case had been moderately covered at the time, not headline material, more of a footnote in the business section. A lower-level analyst at a mid-tier firm who had allegedly stolen and leaked proprietary trading algorithms. Dorian read the summary twice. Then he read the court records his legal team pulled by 9 a.m. Something was wrong with them. Not wrong in an obvious way, nothing forged, nothing missing. But Dorian had spent 15 years reading contracts and financial documents, and he had developed a sense for when something had been constructed rather than discovered. The case against Fen Callaway had the texture of a room that had been cleaned too thoroughly. Every loose thread trimmed. Every witness statement arriving at the same conclusion from slightly different angles in a way that felt rehearsed rather than organic. He kept pulling. By afternoon he had something he hadn't expected to find, a 4-year-old internal audit report that had been filed with his own company's compliance department and then quietly buried. The report alleged that a cluster of early investors, including 2 men who currently sat on his board, had engaged in regulatory manipulation during Ashvale Technologies' initial funding round. The kind of manipulation that would have ended the company before it began if it had surfaced. The report had been filed by an anonymous source. But the filing timestamp, the document formatting style, the specific language used in the financial analysis, Dorian's legal team confirmed it within hours. The anonymous source was Fen Callaway. Dorian sat in his office for a long time after that, looking at the city through the glass wall and thinking about the word collateral, how it meant different things depending on which side of a deal you were standing on. Fen Callaway had tried to reach Dorian directly. There were records of 2 emails sent to a general company address 4 years ago, both routed automatically to a folder managed by Marcus Holt, Dorian's CFO, and never forwarded. 1 week after those emails were sent, Fen Callaway was arrested. Marcus had been with Dorian since the beginning. Sharp, loyal in the way expensive things are loyal, as long as their value is maintained. Dorian had trusted him the way you trust a structure you've never tested because it's never had reason to fail. He called Marcus at 4:30. "The Callaway case," Dorian said, when Marcus answered. "Walk me through what you remember about it." A pause. Brief, a professional pause, not a guilty one. But Dorian had learned to hear the difference. "The name doesn't ring a bell immediately," Marcus said. "Should it?" "Probably not," Dorian said evenly. "I'll follow up." He hung up and sat in the quiet for a moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He drove himself home without calling ahead, without traffic updates, without his phone. Just the rain-wet road and his hands on the wheel and the specific feeling of a man who has spent a decade building something only to discover he may have been building it on someone else's grave. When he got home, Sarah was in the kitchen making tea. She looked up when she heard him. Something in his face made her set the cup down slowly. "You looked him up," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who is he to you?" Dorian asked. The kitchen was very quiet. "He's my brother," she said. What she carried alone. He had expected many things. He had, in the darkest corridor of last night, imagined the worst version of the story, the one where his wife's tears belonged to someone else, where the intimacy of those handwritten letters meant something that unmade him. He had built that version quietly and thoroughly the way the mind does when it is terrified and has nothing else to do with its hands. But he had not imagined this. "Half-brother," Sarah corrected quietly, as though the precision mattered. "We share a father. I didn't know about him until I was 17. Our father, he wasn't a good man to either of us, just in different ways and different houses." She poured the tea she'd made and pushed a cup toward him. He sat down at the kitchen island without meaning to, as though his legs had decided before his mind did. "Fen found me first," she continued. "Reached out when I was in my 2nd year of university. We spent a year just writing letters, figuring out if we were real to each other. And then he became real. The most real person in my life for a while." She paused, wrapped both hands around her cup. He was brilliant. The kind of brilliant that made him angry at things other people accepted. He worked in financial analysis and he kept finding things that didn't add up, and he couldn't leave them alone. Dorian looked at the surface of his tea. Sera. I know, she said. I know you found the audit report. I could tell from your face when you came in. Why didn't you tell me? The question landed between them gently, without accusation, which surprised him, because he had practiced a sharper version of it in the car. She looked at him for a long moment. In the warm kitchen light she looked the way she had the night he'd married her, not younger, exactly, but unguarded in the same way. Open in the specific way people only manage when they are about to say something they have been holding for so long it has become part of their skeleton. Because I found out Fenn had tried to contact your company right before I met you, she said. And then 2 months later he was arrested. And then I met you. And you were so. She stopped. Chose her words carefully. You were so convinced that everything you'd built was yours. Purely yours. And I fell in love with you. Actually in love. Not with the company, not with the name. With the man who laughed at my notebook and ordered terrible coffee and read the last page of books first because he was afraid of being surprised by endings. Dorian's throat tightened. And I was terrified, she continued. That if I told you about Fenn, you would think I'd approached you deliberately. That you'd think the whole thing was a calculation. And then later, when we were married, when it was real, I was terrified that knowing would break something in you. Because I could see how much your integrity meant to you. How much it was the story you told yourself about who you were. She reached across the island and put her hand over his. So I started gathering evidence myself. Quietly. On my own. 2 years of it. Letters from Fenn, documents I requested through legal channels, timelines, she exhaled. I was going to bring it to you when I had something solid enough that you couldn't doubt it. Something that would free him without breaking you. Dorian looked down at her hand on his. You should have told me, he said. I know, she said. You were carrying this alone for 2 years. I know. While I was too consumed with quarterly earnings to notice you were disappearing. Sarah looked up sharply, not at accusation, but at the unexpected honesty of it. Dorian turned his hand over and held hers. Outside the rain had softened to something gentler, less insistent. The kitchen felt smaller than usual and warmer, the way small rooms do when something large has been said inside them and the walls are holding it carefully. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, not passionately, but with a gravity that said I see you more clearly than any declaration. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they stayed like that for a long time in the quiet. 2 people at the beginning of a hard thing, holding on. The board that built the cage. The meeting was called for Thursday morning at 8 a.m. Dorian had said only that it was a strategic review. Nothing alarming in the language. Nothing that would send anyone running. He arrived at 7:40 with his lawyer, an independent forensic accountant, and a drive containing everything. The buried audit, the intercepted emails, the timeline, the financial irregularities from the founding round, and 3 separate testimonies from former employees that his team had collected quietly over the previous 36 hours. Marcus Holt was the first board member to arrive. He sat down across from Dorian with his usual composure, that particular kind of composure that belongs to people who have spent decades being the calmest person in a room and learned to mistake it for innocence. Vivienne Crane came in at 7:58. She was 64, silver-haired, and had the bearing of a woman who had survived multiple corporate restructurings by being the one who restructured. She and Marcus had been among Dorian's earliest investors, the people who had seen something in a 23-year-old with a pitch deck and a stubborn refusal to accept terms. Dorian had been grateful to them for years. He had been grateful to the wrong story of them. Before we begin, Dorian said, when everyone was seated, I want to read something aloud. He read the audit report. All of it. Slowly. The room changed temperature somewhere in the middle of the 3rd paragraph. Vivienne's expression did not move, which was itself a kind of movement. Marcus reached for his water glass once, then seemed to decide against it. When Dorian finished reading, the silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of confession. This document, Vivienne said finally, in a measured tone, was reviewed and dismissed as. It was never reviewed, Dorian said. It was intercepted, assessed for risk, and buried. and the man who filed it was handed to prosecutors on a case constructed from manipulated evidence within 6 weeks of sending it. He looked at Marcus directly. "He never reached me," Dorian said. "You made sure of that?" Marcus said nothing. Which was, Dorian had come to understand, its own kind of language. "I built this company believing it was clean," Dorian continued, and his voice was steady in a way that cost him something. "I told that story to investors, to my staff, to myself. I told it to a woman who deserved better than marrying a man who didn't know the floor beneath him was someone else's collapse." Vivienne leaned forward slightly. "Dorian, you should think carefully about what you do next. This company supports." "I know what it supports," Dorian said. "I also know what it cost." He slid a folder across the table to his lawyer. "Effective today, I'm engaging independent counsel to file for a full case review on Fen Calloway's conviction. I'm submitting this audit and all supporting documentation to the financial regulator. And I'm removing both of you from the board pending investigation." Vivienne stood. "You'll burn everything," she said. Not a threat, almost something sadder, like a warning from someone who has watched fire move before. "Maybe," Dorian said. "But I should have built it differently to begin with." After they left, he sat alone in the boardroom for a few minutes. The city moved silently beyond the glass. He thought about Sarah in the kitchen with her hands around a teacup, carrying 2 years of silence because she loved him enough to want to protect his version of himself. He took out his phone and called her. When she answered, he said, "It's done." A pause. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But I think I will be." After the fire, something softer. Fen Calloway walked out of Harwick Correctional Facility on a Friday morning in early November, when the sky was the color of cold water and the trees along the road had given up their last leaves. Dorian was not there. He had asked Sarah if she wanted him to come and she had said give us an hour first, so he waited in a small cafe down the road and drank coffee that was too strong and thought about the year that had just passed. It had not been a quiet year. The regulatory investigation had moved faster than anyone expected, partly because Dorian had made sure it did, using the same relentlessness he'd once applied entirely to growth metrics and quarterly projections, redirected now toward something that actually kept him awake at night for the right reasons. Marcus Holt had resigned within a month. Vivienne Crane had retained 3 lawyers and settled 2 months after that, a fact that had been reported in the financial press with a restrained language used for things that are shameful but not surprising. Ashvale Technologies had survived, restructured, smaller, and considerably less comfortable, which Dorian had decided was probably the correct shape for it. 3 board seats had been replaced. The company's founding narrative had been publicly revised in a press statement that Dorian had written himself, twice, before he was satisfied with its honesty. The stock had dipped and then steadied. His publicist had been deeply unhappy for several months. He had found, to his own surprise, that he minded none of it as much as he'd expected to. What he had minded, what had cost him genuine sleep and made him quiet in ways Sarah noticed and held space for without demanding explanation, was the simpler thing. The private arithmetic of it. The calculation of how many mornings he had sat across from her at breakfast and talked about market projections while she carried the weight of her brother's imprisonment and her own fear alone in the same body that sat smiling in front of him. He had apologized to her properly once, not the reflexive, face-saving apology of a man caught in something but a real one, long and undefended, said to her in their library at midnight while she sat cross-legged on the window seat and listened with her whole attention. She had listened to all of it. Then she had said, "Dorian, I kept it from you. We both get to be sorry." And then she had moved from the window seat to his lap and kissed him with the kind of slowness that doesn't require anything in return, the kind that says here, still, you, and means all 3 things simultaneously. He had held her face in his hands and kissed her back the same way, unhurried, as if they had invented time themselves and chosen to spend it here. They had been learning each other again, these past months. The real versions, the ones underneath the distance that ambition and fear had built between them without either of them quite intending it. They cooked dinner together now, badly and with great entertainment. She read to him sometimes in the evenings from whatever she was bookbinding, a sentence here, a paragraph there, her voice low and unhurried. He had started leaving his phone in another room after 7 p.m., a small discipline that had turned out to be enormous. The night before Fenn's release, he had held her in the dark and she had traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips the way you touch something you are relieved to still have. "Whatever he's like," Dorian had said quietly, "he's yours. So he matters." She had not answered with words. She had pressed her lips to the corner of his mouth, then his cheek, then the soft space below his ear, and stayed there with her breath warm against his skin, which was, he had come to understand, Sarah's most honest language. Now, sitting in the cafe with his too-strong coffee, he looked up when the door opened. Sarah came in first, and the expression on her face was one he had never seen before, a particular brightness that belonged to something restored. Behind her came a man who was taller than Dorian had imagined, lean, with Sarah's same quality of stillness and the slightly stunned look of someone recently returned to the ordinary world of open doors and ambient noise. Fenn Calloway looked at Dorian for a long moment. "You didn't have to do it the way you did," Fenn said. His voice was quiet and direct. "Publicly. It cost you." "It cost you more," Dorian said. 4 years. Fenn was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from Dorian and sat down. "My sister," he said, with a sideways look at Sarah, who was settling into the chair beside Dorian and stealing his coffee without asking, "writes about you in her letters like you're a decent man." "I'm working on it," Dorian said. Fenn considered this. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but its honest predecessor. "She's particular," Fenn said. "About people." "I know," Dorian said. "It's the most terrifying thing about her." Sarah looked up from the stolen coffee. "I'm right here," she said. Dorian turned to look at her, properly, the way he had not done often enough in the years when everything had felt like a transaction. She looked back at him with those clear, unhurried eyes that had once described a better version of a speech and handed him something to laugh about, and had spent 2 years quietly trying to save him from a truth she'd been afraid would break him, and had broken open in a lamplight library so he could finally understand the shape of what they actually had. He reached under the table and found her hand. She laced her fingers through his without looking down, the way you hold something you already know by heart. Outside the cafe window, November was cold and clean and the trees were bare and waiting, the way things look just before they begin again.